Hello, my dear students! Welcome to our virtual class in Practical Research 1. The following are the different most essential learning competencies and specific objectives that you have to achieve at the end of the lesson.
Let's start our discussion about drawing conclusions. Generally, a research conclusion may be described as the last part of the paper. It wraps up the different parts or components of the paper. The key areas are highlighted based on the analysis or results of the study. It includes a comprehensive summary of the findings. A good conclusion must be connected well with the data analysis to achieve coherence with the information written in the report. This part should be stated in clear, simple language with no new information added into it. This must also answer the questions in the research problem and must contain the findings and results of the study. Remember that conclusions should appropriately answer the specific research questions raised at the beginning of the investigation in the order that they are given under the statement of the problem. It must be based upon the findings and must point out what were factually learned from the inquiry. Let us briefly discuss how research findings are summarized. The summary of findings will serve as takeoff point for the conclusion and recommendation. According to Kretschmer of 2009, research results consist of the following. First, an introductory context for understanding the results by restating the research problem underpinning your study. Next, a summary of your key findings arranged in a logical sequence that generally follows your methodology section. It also includes the inclusion of non-textual elements such as figures, charts, photos, maps, tables, and others to further illustrate key findings if appropriate. Also, it has a systematic description of your results, highlighting for the reader observations that are most relevant to the topic under investigation. Remember also to use the past tense when referring to your results. Then, the page length of your results section is guided by the amount and types of data reported. However, focus only on findings that are important and related to addressing the problem. In terms of summary of key findings, the following characteristics must be observed. First, the presence of a statement on the main purpose of the study, the participants, the period of the study, research methods used, research instrument, and the sampling design. Also, the findings may be taken all together, but each specific question in the statement of the problem must be specified, then followed by the findings that would answer it. And lastly, the findings should be textual overviews, that is, a synopsis of the important data comprising of text and numbers. Only the important findings and highlights of the data should be incorporated in the summary, especially those upon which the conclusion will be based. Now let's learn how to write the conclusion. Conclusions are inferences, deductions, abstractions, implications, interpretations, general statements, and/or generalizations based on findings. Always remember that a good quality conclusion answers the specific questions identified at the introductory phase of the research. Here are some of the tips on what you can do in your conclusion. First, implicitly restate your thesis or position. While it is not advisable from a stylistic standpoint to simply copy your thesis and paste it at the end of your paper, restating your argument in a more general form is important because it shows the reader that you have a cohesive argument that is evident in your work from start to finish. Second, emphasize the importance of your subject by placing it in a larger context. State the significance of your argument by relating it to these larger areas of inquiry. Show how your argument might advance knowledge in a discipline, take a position in a larger debate, or provide solutions to a problem. Third, offer suggestions for the future based on what you have argued. In a similar vein to offering context for your argument, projecting what you have argued into the future allows the reader to see the meaningfulness of your argument. Assuming that you have made your point effectively, the reader is likely to take your predictions seriously and thus see additional relevance in what you have argued up to this point. Looking to the future can also make your reader consider your argument long after they have finished with your paper. And lastly, end on a relevant and powerful quote or anecdote that serves to sum up your paper. If you can, end your conclusion and thus your paper on a succinct quote or illustrative example of your argument. On the other hand, the following are the tips on what not to do in your conclusion. First, do not bring in new material. The conclusion is your space to wrap up your paper and not throw in any additional points that you were not able to work on into your body paragraphs. It is one thing to generalize or place your argument in a broader academic context, but it is quite another to introduce a whole new idea that you do not have room to develop. Second, do not weaken your position by apologizing for what you have already argued. If your paper has followed the conventions of academic writing, if you have created a thesis and given evidence to support your position, then you have met the reader's expectations. Ending your essay by apologizing for your stance distracts from the argument you should actually be emphasizing. Third, do not end on a cliffhanger, leaving the reader feeling unsatisfied. Remember that your paper is meant to provide evidence to support your thesis, so your goal should be to conclude in such a way that the reader feels all questions have been addressed. A paper that hints at further information or that promises to resolve an issue but never does will not help make your argument. Your goal is to create a self-contained argument within the essay, not leave the reader waiting for a sequel. Now let's know how to draw conclusions from patterns and themes. Before writing the conclusion, make sure that you have written first a summary of your findings. The summary of findings serves as a brief restatement of the components of the research paper. Now, a conclusion is like the falling action of a story. At this point, the researcher shall have the chance to leave an important and lasting note to his readers or in a story that make the readers understand the reasons why the villain is the way he is or the protagonist understanding his or her purpose. A conclusion contains insights drawn from the findings of each problem, which answer the questions presented at the beginning of the research paper. Therefore, the conclusion part stresses the importance of the thesis statement, gives the written work a sense of completeness, and leaves a final impression and demonstrates a good organization. Presented on your screen is the sample summary of the research findings. Please read silently the sample findings of the study. Based on the summary and findings, here is a sample conclusions or implications. Now let's move on to formulating recommendations based on conclusions. Recommendation is a section which presents and discusses how they support the findings and conclusion. Research readers need insightful comments, and for them to be able to cite your study or even apply it in their daily lives, they need the recommendations. A recommendation is a suggestion that it improves the study for future research to be conducted in the field. It also includes suggestions for what needs to be done as a result of the research findings. It is a part of the paper where you make suggestions about some resolutions as a response to the research problem. It must be a consistent part of the conclusion. It proposes specific solutions connected with the findings and must be supported by relevant data and specific data from findings. Always remember that the recommendation section must be usually listed in order of priority. Here are some of the tips on how to write recommendations. First, you should not really recommend anything that you have not previously discussed in the discussion. The rule of no new material in your conclusion is also applicable to your recommendations. Second, recommendations are not the same as conclusions. Consider recommendations go one step further than conclusions as something, someone, and needs to do. Furthermore, There may be different levels within your set of recommendations, with recommendations for academic, for policymakers, for practitioners, for recommendations for trainings or education. Please take note that you don't have to write recommendations that are too broad, too generic, or those that are not directly related to the topic of the research. Acceptable and credible recommendations show the following characteristics. First, it must be logical. Make sure that they flow sensibly from the conclusions. Also, it must be relevant. It can be achieved when they meet the purpose and the scope as stated in the introduction. Third, it must be concise. It must use words that are precise and give reason for the recommendation, which is given only if necessary. And lastly, it must be clear. You have to avoid ambiguity. This section should have aim and effort to solve problems in the study. It should ensure a continuous benefit to individual persons and the larger society. Keep in mind that recommendations are written to improve the study. From the given conclusions earlier, here is a sample recommendations made by the researchers. And now let's proceed to our last topic, which is listing references. As you all know, it is quite important to recognize the efforts of other people in the success of your research, because without them, your research would not have been good. And nothing spells this appreciation better than listing them in the references. References must be treated judiciously and make sure that one applies the required format. There are various referencing styles such as the APA, MLA, and Chicago Manual of Style to name a few. The following are the different whys in referencing in research. First, to share the hard work of the experts. Second, to show distinctions of which are your ideas versus the expert's ideas. Next, to respect the work done by the expert. Another is to allow future researchers to retrieve sources. Next is to add authority of your work by using time-tested evidences. And to assure readers that you as a researcher read and understood other researches. The use of reference lists in scholarly disciplines will allow you to credit the work of others that directly influence the present work and document any facts that are not common knowledge. It also gives readers the information necessary to identify and retrieve the sources. Remember that reference list is one of the ways to show ethical considerations in writing research. Shown in your screen is an example of the reference list.
That's all about our lesson for this week in Practical Research 1. Thank you for watching and see you again next week.